So we have finished the Eightfold Path, and as I said once or twice through, one of the things I want to talk about, really for the sake of unity again, is the idea of how Christianity and Buddhism are really compatible in many ways. And while I've had more than a few people over the years on either side, either Christians or Buddhists, tell me that I was doing a disservice to their religion or their philosophy by trying to link them, I've had a profoundly different experience. And so today I want to bridge the gap on one very, very important point. But to start with my own personal experience, many, many years ago when I got into mental health and addiction work, I met a young man who, on the day I met him, within probably 10 minutes, he said to me, he has a good friend who stopped using heroin by studying Buddhism. Could we do that? And I thought, my job was to help people stop doing drugs. I mean, I didn't know almost anything about Buddhism, but I thought, sure, why not? If it worked, I'd like to be able to help, so let's dive into it together. So around 2004, I started diving into some Buddhist ideas, and I realized how effective they were. Now, I love to emphasize that Buddha was alive 500 years before Jesus. He didn't have the benefit of learning or reading any of Jesus's teachings. And I love to ask the question, do you think the Holy Spirit existed before Jesus? Was it here? Or did Jesus come down and was he just sort of like a beacon for it, to show people the way? Well, I very strongly believe the Holy Spirit existed well before Jesus was here. And is it possible people before Jesus got close to the truth or maybe even fully found the truth? And I say absolutely yes. And my experience is that Buddha was absolutely one of them. And then Jesus comes later, but I'm a huge fan of Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God. And that would include Buddhist philosophy, right? And that's coming from the Bible. So my personal experience when I worked with this young man is it worked. He got off heroin too. And I realized, okay, Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. All of us are children of God, so certainly that includes Buddha and his followers. So I was on board. And then I realized when my understanding of Buddhism went higher and higher, so did my understanding of Christianity. So did my personal experience of exactly what Jesus was doing. It strengthened and deepened. It didn't take me away from Jesus at all. It took me deeper into it. And that's when I decided to journey down into some other paths and other religions and philosophies and see what I could find there. Keeping in mind that all things work together for good for those who love God, I found just treasures and, just wonderful things to be discovered in other philosophies. So all these years later, I work on all philosophies as linked to God. But there's this one issue that hasn't really bugged me, but it's bugged others. It's only bugged me because it's bugged others. Is that this particular philosophy / religion, or whatever you want to call it, that I've loved so much, this Buddhist philosophy, doesn't talk about God. And it doesn't use the word God. And I've had more than a few people who are critical on one side or the other of that. You're talking about God. Buddhists don't talk about God. Or Buddhists saying, if you're talking about God, you shouldn't be doing that. And Christians thinking I'm guiding people away from Jesus by talking about Buddha and things like that. I'm like, we need to bridge the gap. I personally never had any problem bridging the gap, but that this one concept about what God is, and do Buddhists believe in one or not, and is it okay to use the concept, has always sort of stuck with me as something I wanted to clarify. So here we go, we're going to clarify. Now, hopefully, if you've been with us or watched all the series of the Eightfold Path, you remember this particular drawing and some of the concepts in step 8 of the Eightfold Path, because I'm about to address some of them very clearly using a Buddhist teacher who talks about this very concept. But we're going to start by first illustrating the complexity in talking about religion and spirituality and using the word God, because we all have a different understanding and definition for God. And one of the biggest problems of all is illuminated in the first chapter, the first verse really of the Tao Te Ching, that the Tao that can be named is not the Tao, that there aren't words for it. It's impossible to adequately describe God using human words, right? And that's sufficient for me, that concept. I'm like, yeah, well, I'm using words, so that's not going to work. It has to be something else beyond that. But of all the words that I've ever come across that explain it the best, and I'll get chills again just reading this, comes from Faust, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German author who wrote the play Faust. And in it, he's describing and talking to his true love, Margaret, the nature of God and spirituality. And he gives the best definition of God I've ever heard. And he refers to the Tao in the first line. He says, "Who dares name the nameless?" So right off the bat, we're talking about, let's agree, it's pretty hard to describe God, okay? To give it a name. Hard to do. Then he goes on, "Fill your heart from it. It is so vast, and when you are blessed by the deepest feeling, call it whatever you wish. Joy, heart, love, God. I have no name for it. Feeling is all. Names are sound and smoke, veiling heaven's bright glow." See, words get in the way. It reminds me of Course in Miracles, that words are illusions, right? If human beings are debating the meaning of words, what is God? Should I use God? Should I not use God? Okay? We're losing whatever God is. And that would be on both sides, the Christians or the Buddhists. Either side, I like to say, as Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. Well, what are we talking about here? People are interested in bridging this gap. People who want to come together to understand what truth is and experience this idea of God, whatever it may be. But if we're debating the idea of the word God, we just lost it right there. And so with that in mind, Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, he says, "A rose by any other name may still smell as sweet," right? And so to back up Faust here, I don't care what you call it, it exists. It's the Tao. There aren't words for it. We can get close, maybe approximate it, but the moment you start debating and arguing with someone over it, you probably just lost it, okay? So I'm going to use some other words, mine, but also a Buddhist teacher here, to try to help close the gap. And again, the best we can do is get a close approximation. And then, as Faust says, if you have been blessed by the deepest feeling, you no longer need to debate it. You're like, okay, whatever that feeling is, we'll just call that God. We'll just go from there, okay? But I'm going to use a Buddhist teacher today to explain God from their perspective, which I think is fabulous, okay? So, the name of this teacher is Soyun Shaku. He was born in the 1800s. He came to the United States over 100 years ago with this exclusive or the express intent of trying to help teach Buddhism to Christians, or at least to Americans. And he knew from the beginning that the hardest challenge for him was going to be to cross this chasm of what God is and whether or not these are diametrically opposed philosophies or not. And he said in his book called Zen for Americans, Sermons of a Buddhist Abbot, this is a 1906 book, he says, "The object of this discourse is to elucidate the Buddhist conception of God." All right, so right there we've got a Buddhist, a pretty high-ranking one, saying, all right, we're cool with God. We don't have a problem with it, but let's talk about your conception of it, because that's what matters. Now, he specifically says that Buddhism certainly has a God. Okay, so that right there, for all the Buddhists out there that will criticize me for using the word, hey, this is a Zen master saying Buddhists certainly have a God. This God is the highest reality and truth through which and in which this universe exists. However, followers of Buddhism usually avoid the term God. Now, we can make this really clear, really simply. Why? You ask any 5-year-old who's in a church, where's God? Does God exist? Yes. Where is he? And they'll all do the same thing, right? 100%, without fail, they'll all point up. I've done this many times in public lectures, and well-seasoned adults, again, they point up. God is up, because that's what we got trained to think. God's up somehow. Up in heaven, in the bottom of heaven. If I drive up, I'd have to drill a hole to get into where God's sitting on a throne. I mean, that's the conceptualization. And Buddhists don't talk about that God in the way Christians often use that God, because it immediately puts God outside of us. We think God is up. Meanwhile, where does Jesus say God is? In. So if we teach kids, where's God? We should do this. And the idea of using the concept of God, Buddhists figured out that the ego is dastardly. The ego immediately puts concepts of God in the wrong place. And so it pushes us away from God as a result. And that's one reason, one primary reason they don't use the word God. And the idea of God as a personal God, a dude sitting in a throne in the sky, they reject. I happen to reject that God too. I believe Jesus does as well, as we'll talk about in his words coming up. God is not made in our image. We are made in God's image. That is a big deal, something that this Buddhist teacher talks about as well. That the fact is, he says, quote, God must be in us. we are made in his likeness, and our faith is to believe in our essential oneness with him and not in our sensual separateness. Sensual separateness means through our five senses. We don't see God. I don't hear him, right? Physically speaking, don't touch, stuff like that. And so this is Shaku saying that, hey, this God we're talking about certainly must be in us because we are made in his likeness. God in us and we in him must be the most fundamental faith of all religion, he says. That's a Buddhist teacher saying, hey, if we're going to talk about God, let's put God in the right place, in us. And that God is everywhere in us and we're in him. Okay, that's important. Should be in all the religions. He goes on, the Buddhist God is absolute and transcendent. This world being merely its manifestation is necessarily fragmental and imperfect. Okay, because it's only part of whatever God is. There's a lot more, but we're in a part of it. To define it more exactly in the Buddhist notion of the highest being, it may be convenient to borrow the term panentheism. Now, pantheism is God as nature, that when you're looking about, you see God. But panentheism is not just this, nature, but it's everything else you can't see. It's absolutely all of experience. God is every aspect of your being and every aspect of the universe and every aspect of things you can see and not see, okay? That is Shaku saying the Buddhist conception of God is panentheism, meaning God is everywhere and God is everything. God is your enemies. God is your adversities. God is all the struggles and the challenges and the crucifixions. God is that. God is also sunsets and rainbows and babies and all of that. God is all of it, all of it. That's the Buddhist conception of God. Pretty broad and expansive, right? But is anything limited? No, nothing at all. It's all God all the time. And he goes on. However different and separate and irreducible things may appear to the senses, which is what we talked about in step 8. The fact that all different manifestations of the same thing, this physical world has a lot of stuff going on in it, and that there's a lot of apparent separation. Einstein started with E equals mc squared. You have energy and you have mass and you have light and you have things in the physical world, but it's all energy. And Einstein's the one that said different manifestations of the same thing. So it's the same stuff expressed differently. And when we talk about H2O, because it's an obvious example, I have a wonderful poem coming up on this exact point. H2O is definitely expressed differently. Even though it's one thing, it could be expressed in many different ways. And as we went on in Samadhi, in the Eightfold Path, you have to get to a point where you see that sense objects cannot be differentiated from the observer. Here I have the football and the observer. And the truth of the matter is, the Buddha said there are no independent sense objects. No, there are no independent objects. Everything that seems to be separate really isn't. It's intimately related to you because it's a projection of your mind in one way or another. And that's where the physics comes in with the observer effect and superposition. The truth is, you can't separate them. Even though they appear to be separate, you can't separate them. And so he says, however different and separate and irreducible things may appear to the senses, the most profound law of the human mind declares that they are all one in their hidden nature. In this world of relativity, I love it, he references Einstein, literally about 2 years before Einstein does the theory of relativity. In this world of relativity, and that means you have an individual perspective, you do, all of us have an individual, unique perspective, and that's where the separation comes from. You're God experiencing it from your perspective, you're from your perspective, and all of us are, and that's apparent separation. From the world of relativity, subject and object, thought and nature are separate and distinct. But the very constitution of the mind demands a unifying principle, which is an indispensable hypothesis for our conception of phenomenality, which is our experience. That's a fancy way of saying our minds aren't satisfied with the fact that it's separate. We want to see something unify it. I say that's where God shows up. Okay, God properly understood, you're about to see, God properly understood brings it all together. God not properly understood leads to war. Okay? So he says, in this hypothesis, he's calling it a gate of sameness. The gate of sameness, in contradiction to the gate of difference. And Buddhism declares that no philosophy or religion is satisfactory which does not recognize both of these gates. There's a gate of sameness and there's a gate of difference. In some measure, the gate of sameness may be considered to correspond to God, and the gate of difference to the world of our individual existence. Now let's explain that clearly. As we talked about, there's same and there's different, okay? And there's a whole lot of different ways to look at that, but for sure, in order to experience God, you have to recognize sameness. That's going back to Faust again. When you feel the feeling of sameness, I don't care what word you call it. You don't even have to say there's a God. I don't care. I just had the experience of God. I know it exists. When you fundamentally have that, that's the sameness. That's the unity. It's why Krishna in the Gita says that in order to attain the infinite spirit, you have to recognize the unity in all beings. It's the sameness. Or we're going to focus on the gate of difference. The gate of difference is going to be stuff like race and gender and, religion and whose prophet is better and all of that. That's what gets people arguing, looking at the differences. The gate of sameness is the thing that brings people together. It's unifying, after all. And here you have the Buddhists saying the gate of sameness is God. Well, we just got done doing step 8 of the Eightfold Path. Samadhi comes from the root word sama, which means same. Okay? And to express or to have the experience, says Thich Nhat Hanh, of samadhi, which is the reward, if you will, of going on a spiritual journey, to have that experience, you have to recognize others as somehow part of you. And to sit back and argue and debate, first of all, the use of the word God, guess what? Whatever your definition is somehow the same as mine. That's to do it correctly. I have to embrace your definitions in order to experience sameness. I can't cast yours apart and say, well, mine's better than yours or whatever. And so clearly, in order to experience God, we have to go through the gate of sameness. Well, I wonder, the gate of sameness, if Jesus ever said anything along those lines. Matthew 7:13. Enter through the narrow gate, he says, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter. Now, what if he was specifically referring to these two gates? Because he was. And he was saying, well, the narrow gate is the gate in order for you to get to the kingdom of heaven. That's the gate we're supposed to enter through. That's the gate of sameness. How many people are walking around looking at each other as the same? How many people are looking at, Muslims or Jews or atheists as the same as them somehow? Not many. Those who want to experience God will do that, though. Or how many people are willing to say that, well, they say there's no God, I say there is a God, or vice versa. And they're like, yeah, I'm cool with that. Or how many people would argue, well, you're wrong because of this. The people who want to experience God say, I'm good with your definition of it. That's cool. You probably mean something similar to me anyways, right? That's experiencing God. Jesus says, enter through that gate. The way is wide that leads to destruction. Well, that's the gate of difference, isn't it? Very clearly. I'm going to notice our differences. I'm going to argue that my prophet is better than yours, and you're going to hell because, right? You can't be right because my daddy and my daddy before him and all the way back told me that it's this guy you're supposed to believe in. And that's not the gate of sameness, is it at all? And again, that's the Buddhist perception of God in that regard. It's the gate of unity. And if you want to experience God, he's saying, just like we just did with Samadhi, you better recognize the sameness in things. And in the very least, this lake in the middle of Mountain of Truth, in which we have all these varying experiences, the bear and the fires and the snakes and all of that, and the hot day, all of that. All of us have this lake in the middle of us. All of us have this crystal clear blue water consciousness. That's the source of our being. All of us have it. That's how we're all the same. It doesn't matter what costume you're wearing. You have that lake, so do I. Find it. And when you find it, and if I'm there, it'll be like, okay, there you are. I understand our costumes didn't matter. We all came from the same source to have this experience. And that's the ultimate sameness. So, does Jesus talk about this kind of stuff? Of course, not only did he mention the narrow gate to go through, what does he say when he was asked about the most important commandments? He did not say don't kill. He did not say don't cheat or don't steal or whatever. He did not say you only got to believe in me. That's not what he said when he was asked the most important commandments. What did he say? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. What does that mean other than love everything, embrace it all? The same way. Love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Wow, that's radical. Especially because what the humans and egos want to do, we don't like things. We wish they weren't happening. We don't understand the big picture, that the only way to get back home is to love everything. Remember, that doesn't mean you have to like it. That's key. I don't see many prophets talk. Jesus didn't like his crucifixion, I'm sure. And you don't have to vote for your enemy, but you have to love them. I mean, that's key. And so to get to the place of operating from loving God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, all of it, not 90%, all of it is ultimate sameness. Love prevails all the time. That is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, which is another way of saying the same. There he goes again. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we already had that up there, talking about that last time. That's the ultimate in Christian sameness, is it? It literally is as yourself. That's totally the same. Love is everyone, everything, everywhere. And that's what you are. You're made in God's image. Well, guess what it says in 1 John 4:8? It says God is love. Now, if you're made in God's image and God is love, what does that make you? It makes you love, okay? You're only temporarily your costume. In order to remember what you really are, or to awaken to that, you have to love everything. And no amount of ego chatter in your head, remember all of the Buddhist philosophy we just went through in the Eightfold Path, our suffering comes from our attachment to our perspective, physical world things. And we say, I don't like this, I wish it was different. Boom, you just lost love. You just stepped out of the lake. But if you can learn how to love everything, then you've got it. And if you swim in that lake, you know you're one with it. How can you be in a lake and not be part of the lake? You're part of the lake. This whole thing is love. And you're supposed to resonate with it, and it with you. God is in you, you're in God, right? That's the Buddhist conception of God. And I'm showing you it's the Christian conception of God. It's the same thing. Jesus is saying all of the same stuff. Loving a neighbor as yourself is sameness. And what does he say in Mark 12:29? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. All right, straight up, he's saying it's the same. Now, the problem is people think the Lord is him, and it is him, because he was one. He was filled with Christ, he was filled with the light, and he loved everybody, including his crucifiers, right? He loved his enemies. He loved his adversity. He struggled with it at times, but he knew he needed to love it. That's what made him sinless. And by the end, he loved in full, didn't he? With every ounce of his being. And he did for us what we can't do for ourselves very well. But if we learn from him, we can love like him. And that's the answer. He was taking us to this place where we could love all the adversities and we can see the sameness in everything. He was unifying everything. That's what he did there. And so Jesus is totally backing up the exact idea of the Buddhist philosophy. So I'll tell you now a Japanese poem that backs this up, and this is beautiful. Rain and hail and ice and snow, neither like the other, so when they melt, however low, see one stream of water flow. So we have rain and hail and ice and snow, different things, right? But of course, when they melt, they're the same. Well, guess what? Here we are in the world, and that's what we're experiencing. We experience the differences, but we're supposed to perceive the same. Okay, that's the love. That's the Buddhist idea of God. So Shaku rejects, he says, a God who stays aloof from his creation, sends down his words of command, and is specifically rejected by Buddhists, and is against the constitution of human reason. God must be in us, and we are made in his likeness. Okay? The idea of some big daddy in the sky calling down upon us and chastising us for being bad and all that ain't love, right? And it's, as he says, against the constitution of human reason. It never felt right with me. And most people who get taught that type of Christian God, it doesn't feel right with them. It doesn't work anyways. Those who love it are the ones who get into arguments and fight and saying you're going to hell, because Jesus never talked like that. He said you're all forgiven. It was just love all the time. That's what he did. And Shaku says, God, or the principle of sameness, is not transcendent but immanent in the universe, meaning everywhere all the time. It's not better or above us. It's all of it all the time. And we sentient beings are manifesting the divine glory just as much as the lilies of the field. Now here I could go off on a few roomy directions, but the point is essentially this. If we would just let that force in us, we would allow that to flow through us. The ego is put out of the way. We would trust everything, and we would feel the divine experience through us, just like the lilies of the field. So now we have a Buddhist saying our faith is to believe in our essential oneness with God. Powerful. And what does Jesus say? John 10:34, he quotes God himself by saying, ye are gods. Did you forget that, he said to the other leaders of the day, did you forget that in your good book it says you're God's children of the Most High? In fact, God himself said all of you are children of the Most High. Who did he say wasn't? Except those Buddhists and those Muslims. He didn't say that. All of you are children of the Most High. How do you get there? Through love. As Jesus says, you can blaspheme against me. You can even blaspheme against God by saying God's name wrong or whatever. But you can't blaspheme against the Holy Spirit. And he's referring to the highest level of love, agape, sameness. You can't say no to that. That's the one thing you have to agree with. You have to. And that's Jesus saying, go ahead, blaspheme against him. And I'm not even blaspheming them. I'm just quoting him. Okay? He said that you got to love your enemy and love another as yourself. Love, and Paul goes on with loving your adversities. You know, all those various things. Why? Because in the end, Jesus says, Luke 17:21, because the kingdom of God is within you. Okay? We're not talking about an up quality. We're talking about an inner quality and an outer quality. It's all of it. It's not up. It's all of us all the time. In that way, Buddhists and Christians do indeed have the same God.